Hello, everybody. This is going to be 22.1 Fighting for the Four Freedoms, World War II. What are the four freedoms? Good question. Let's take a look at them. The four freedoms were mentioned by FDR in a speech in January of 1941, almost a year before we got into the war. However, the war was raging in Europe and in Asia, and so FDR had these thoughts on his mind. And so Roosevelt used his speech to call for a world that was based on the four what he called essential human freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And there was a painter named Norman Rockwell who created illustrations of these four freedoms, as they were called, and they became immensely popular both during and after the war. So here is Rockwell's freedom of speech, freedom to worship, each according to the dictates of his own conscience, according to Rockwell. Freedom from want, a very popular painting of Rockwell's. If you don't believe me, take a look at the end of Lilo and Stitch. This is parodied by Lilo and Stitch. Anyway, and also freedom from fear, with the two kids getting tucked in by the parents. The dad is holding on to a newspaper that's full of atrocities. And so we are protecting the kids from that fear. Now, as America's entering the war in 1941 and 42, this came to the forefront of what we're fighting for here. Why are we fighting? It can't just be another World War One where we don't know what we're fighting for. We have to have a specific reason this time. And the paintings do use this sort of small town nostalgia of, like, the little town in upstate New York or something like that to kind of signify what we're fighting for. However, the implications of the Second World War were huge. There was massive mobilization, industrialization across the country and across the world. The power of the federal government in the United States skyrocketed during this time, and so did the money that we were spending on the military. World War II also made America much more of a global player. Threats could no longer be ignored just because they weren't in the Western Hemisphere. World War II, really taught us, above many other things, that the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean will no longer save us from getting involved in foreign affairs. They can hop the ocean now. The war also, and this is something that we've seen many times in this book, brought into question what it meant to be an American and how we sort of view Americanness, especially when it comes to different groups: women, men, um, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and in particular in World War II, Japanese Americans as well, have very different wartime experiences. Now, even before the war, FDR was sort of thinking internationally a little bit. However, he was thinking in terms of the Great Depression and trying to end it. He thought that if we could get sort of trading with other countries in the Western Hemisphere, that it would be good for us, good for America. And so this is a lot less of a, Teddy Roosevelt big stick sort of diplomacy, and more like, let's get rid of some of that. So, for instance, he did a couple things that were trying to open diplomatic doors to other countries. First of all, he actually recognized the USSR as a legit government. He even sent an ambassador there, and they sent one to us. First time since the Russian Revolution. He also got rid of American troops in Haiti and Nicaragua. He got rid of the Platt Amendment in Cuba, or at least allowed it. So these were part of these sort of goodwill efforts towards Latin America, known as the Good Neighbor policy, though they weren't always great neighbors. So, for instance, one of the issues is we supported dictators in Latin America who were sort of siding with us. That was the dark side of the Good Neighbor policy, I guess. Now, Europe and Asia very quickly overshadowed the whole Latin American good neighbor policy thing. They were still our allies throughout the war, but Asia and Europe suddenly sort of loomed large in front of us. In 1931, Japan attacked northern China, the area called Manchuria, or Manchukuo, depending on how you where you are. And throughout the rest of that decade, it continued to push deeper into China, especially. These attacks left hundreds of thousands of Chinese people dead. Most gruesomely was the Japanese attack at the country of or at the city of Nanjing, where over 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were brutally executed by the Japanese invaders. So here is Japanese expansion into China and into the rest of Asia. You can see that green area right there is Manchuria, where they first invaded, but they also got the Koreas at that point. There was also war brewing in Europe. So Adolf Hitler, the leader of the not newly formed, but newly empowered Nazi Party in Germany, ignored the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles and continued to rebuild their German armed forces. And he continued to expand. He took the Rhineland between France and Germany in 1936 and basically said, "Who's going to stop me?" And nobody did, at least the Europeans did not. The rest of the League of Nations did nothing to stop him. They sort of said, "We don't like it," but they didn't try to stop him. So he thought, well, they're not going to stop me later on, too. He took Austria in what is known as the Anschluss, or the joining, basically saying that, well, Germany and Austria are basically the same place. And then later on, he took the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in 1938, saying, well, this is German too, and I promise this is the last time. And then he took the rest of Czechoslovakia soon after that. So we see that Hitler is just expanding and expanding and being enabled by the fact that nobody's trying to stop him either. Similarly, the fascist leader Benito Mussolini conquered the country of Ethiopia, and Francisco Franco in Spain led an uprising. He was a general in the army and overthrew the democratically elected leader of Spain at that time. So we see sort of the rise of fascism in Europe at this time. So here's Adolf Hitler, the chancellor, and then the Fuhrer, or leader of Germany. He got rid of the chancellorship, got rid of democracy in Germany. He is responsible for the deaths of at least 6 million people. And a quote from him is, "If you tell a big enough lie and tell it frequently enough, it will be believed." And here is Benito Mussolini, known as Il Duce. He was the leader of the fascist party, the creator of fascism, the founder of it. Fascism is in general a far-right belief focused on militarism, nationalism, and a totalitarian autocracy with a strong man up at the top. He once said, "The truth is that men are tired of liberty," and he sure planned to take that liberty away. And so here's the German Anschluss, or joining, where Germany took Austria. And if you notice, right next to the right of Germany is Czechoslovakia, which was their next target. Now, as the 1930s are continuing, Roosevelt is becoming very concerned about Hitler's expansion. He's also very worried about the obvious anti-Semitism that Hitler was showing. I mean, he wrote about it in books. He was not subtle. And by this point, Hitler had already stripped the Jewish citizens of Germany of their citizenship. This is called the Nuremberg Laws. Stripped them of their citizenship as Germans, stripped them of their rights, of their goods, of their houses. And he had also begun sending people into concentration camps and into areas of the city that were blocked off and turned into Jewish ghettos as well. However, most of Europe was they were cognizant of this, but they were still kind of recovering from World War I and from the Great Depression and saying, we don't want to get involved in another gigantic war. And so Europe was appeasing Hitler, sort of enabling this, and Roosevelt was not willing to fight him on it when he was all the way over there. So this led to Roosevelt calling for what he called a quarantining of fascism, but not take any direct action, at least not right at this point. Now, the Germans also were, in general, the Americans were, in general, unprepared to go into another war. There was a lot of isolationism, a lot of feelings of that. Basically, a lot of Americans saying, we don't want to do this again. Many Americans were very cautious about the fact that, a war would be horrendous, just like the first one was. Others and this is a darker side of the story, many people were approving of Hitler or admiring Hitler, especially because he was seen as sort of the solution to the communist problem in Europe. We were worried about communism, if you remember the Red Scare. So Hitler seemed like a good way to keep them in check, basically. There were also some Americans who are pacifists. And lastly, there are a lot of German and Italian Americans who are not interested in fighting their mother country. We also see this with Irish Americans. Irish Americans are not eager to jump into the war because Ireland is fighting for its independence from Great Britain at that time, and also Ireland is remaining neutral in this. So this led to a lot of isolationism, a desire to stay out of the foreign entanglements. And this kept us out of war for a while. Here is a 1939 political cartoon sort of showing the rationale for isolationism, saying, stay out for democracy is saying this, stay out for my sake as well as your own, and that America is the last refuge of democracy, and the only way to save democracy in America is to stay out of war-mad Europe over there. So this is called the only way we can save her is by staying out. Now, in 1935, Congress was trying to stay out. They passed a series of neutrality acts, basically saying, this is a bit of both sidesism here. We are staying out of the conflict entirely. We don't care if you're the British. We don't care if you're the Germans. If you are fighting, we are not trading with you. And so that banned travel on warish ships. It stopped the trade of weapons to any warring nations, and generally just said, we're not interested. There were some groups who disagreed with our isolationist tactics. There were hundreds, even thousands possibly, of American volunteers who went to go fight the fascists in Spain without the approval of the U.S. government. They were called the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. But in the end, Franco and the Spanish fascists were the victors in that war. Partially, this was due to America refusing to send military aid to either side, and so Franco was able to defeat the Spanish government because we weren't really helping them out militarily. So here are some members of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Now, the war in Europe. After England and France's inaction at this time, Hitler and the Soviet Union, which was led by Joseph Stalin, signed a non-aggression pact. So this is Germany and the USSR saying we're not going to fight each other. And this surprised a lot of people because the two countries were generally seen as enemies. I mean, fascism on the far right and communism on the far left don't like each other by their very existence, basically. However, what people did not know is that Germany and Russia had also signed a secret deal where they said, okay, once this war starts, we're going to basically divide Poland in half, and we each get a chunk of it. The war began officially September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Adolf Hitler. Britain and France had promised at this point to protect Poland. They said no further, basically, and this led them to declare war on Germany. Over the next year, though, the German blitzkrieg, these sort of lightning-fast strikes into enemy territories, super fast-moving German advances, drove Germany across much of Western Europe, defeating Belgium, huge chunks of Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and lastly, and most terribly for the Allies, France was overthrown in the course of like a month, basically. So here is Hitler and Stalin at the wedding saying, I wonder how long the honeymoon will last. As we're going to find out, it did not last very long. Now, by June of 1940, Hitler had even defeated France, who he thought was going to hold out for a super long period of time, maybe even beat the Germans. And in doing so, they'd also pushed the British Army all the way back to the coast, where they had to be rescued in the Dunkirk evacuation of 1940. In September of 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan formally called themselves the Axis power, the three main allied countries of the Axis. There were others, but these are the three bigs. Then Germany started to attack England, not by boat and not on foot, but they started to fly over England in what's called the Battle of Britain. Deadly air assaults over the course of a year, where they kept bombing English cities, causing death and destruction and mayhem along the way. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, said that he believed, this is in a speech that he gave right after the Dunkirk evacuation, that that the new world, he's talking about America, will eventually come to the rescue of the old. He believed America would come to British aid, but for a good solid year, England was basically the last holdout of democracy in Europe, and that had a lot of people very worried. So here is Europe in 1940. We see that Germany has advanced through France and through Poland, that they had allies in Italy and Vichy France and Hungary and Slovakia and Romania and North Africa and so on and so forth. Here, by the way, is Winston Churchill, very important guy. 1874 to 1965, he's from England. He was a soldier, he was an author, he was an historian. He was one of the Sea Lords during World War I. He was a member of Parliament, and he was Prime Minister of Great Britain twice. He was also half American. This is something I didn't know about him at first. His mother was actually the daughter of a very wealthy American businessman. And he actually said that he was going to land with the army on D-Day, despite the fact that he was well past his sell-by date and walking with the cane. The King of England had to specifically say, "You're not going," before he decided not to do it. He once also famously said after the Dunkirk evacuations, talking about England's unwillingness to deal with Germany, saying, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight in the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." This is one of his famous speeches right here. He gave a lot of very good speeches. He was a very good speaker. Now, slowly, America was realizing that these threats were threats to us as well. Even though they were in Europe at the time, they weren't going to stay there. So our military, under FDR's leadership, was slowly beginning to rearm, and Congress agreed to let England buy weapons from us on a cash-only basis. Meanwhile, certain groups started to form to try to stop us from getting involved. Groups like the America First Committee, that included people like Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, Father Charles Coughlin, who we talked about back a chapter or so ago, and hundreds of thousands of other members. Their power diminished quite a bit after Pearl Harbor, of course. So here is an anti-America, let's say it correctly, an anti-America First cartoon. So this is a cartoon that is against the America First Committee. And it shows two children being read a book about Adolf the Wolf by an America First lady. And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but these were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. This, weirdly enough, is by Dr. Seuss, who was a political cartoonist before he became a children's book author. Interesting. So, in the midst of all this, Roosevelt decided to break with tradition, and he broke precedent and ran for a third term for presidency. There was nothing that said he couldn't. It was just that Washington didn't. And so he said, you know what? It's necessary right now because of the growing danger from Europe and the still recovery of depression here in America. I don't know why I put England there, but I meant America. Anyway. FDR pretty handily beat Wendell Willkie, who was a Wall Street businessman, but not quite as much as he did the first two. People were kind of like, this is a little weird. We don't do the whole 3 terms thing here in America. But he went on. And in 1941, Roosevelt signed what's called the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to send military aid to allied nations like England and Russia. And we did it with the pretty ridiculous they promised that they would return all these weapons after the war, which is silly. Of course, they weren't going to do that, but we needed an excuse to be able to give them the weapons. This sent guns to England, to China, to the USSR. By the way, by this point, Hitler had double crossed the USSR, as many people thought he would. Hitler went back on his treaty with Stalin and attacked Russia, hoping to conquer it very quickly in the Blitzkrieg. We will see later on that was a bad idea. FDR also suspended trading with Axis powers, especially Japan, who depended upon our supplies and especially our oil. They were not an oil-rich nation. And slowly, groups started to form demanding that America did enter the war. They said that this is not just a European war, it is for American democratic ideals. It is against tyranny, it is for democracy. So, here is a political cartoon of Hitler stabbing Stalin in the back and saying, "Forgive me, comrade, but it seems such a good opportunity." And here is a poster from the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, one of the groups that popped up before the war, saying, "Help Britain defend America, speed production." What finally got us into the war was Pearl Harbor. Most of America was focused on the threat of fascism in Europe. We kind of got blindsided by Japan. In November of 1941, we got messages, we intercepted coded messages actually that said, Japan's looking to attack America. We didn't know when, though, and we didn't know when it was going to happen. It happened on a Sunday, which is a sneak attack. Most of America was either waking up late or going to church. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And their hope was that they could completely disable the American Navy, basically knock us out of the war before we even got into the war. And this would allow them to conquer Southeast Asia without having to worry about America. So here's one of the famous photos of it. This is the sinking of the USS Arizona, which you can still go visit. It sank in shallow water. You can still see the oil rising from the USS Arizona. It's still bleeding oil all these years later. Now, Pearl Harbor was a devastating, demoralizing loss for us. Over 2,000 Americans were killed, and a large portion of our Navy was destroyed. The only hope spot in all of this was the fact that they missed our aircraft carriers that were out of harbor that morning. Roosevelt, on December 8th, declared war on Japan, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, one of his great lines. This got everybody on board except for Jeannette Rankin, who he met back in World War I. She also voted no to World War I. She's the only one to vote no to World War II. America got into the war, and the day after that, Germany declared war on us. So we are full on into the war. Here is Roosevelt addressing Congress on December 8th, 1941. Now, let's first look at the war in the Pacific. America was entering and that was really good for the Allies because the Axis had been having a lot of early support. And they continued to have early support or early victories against America, particularly against our forces in the Pacific Ocean. Because once the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, they very quickly attacked American spots in Asia as well. They'd already conquered a good chunk of Southeast Asia and China. And once America joined the war, they focused on Guam, which was an American territory, and they also were able to defeat the American forces in the Philippines, although they held out as long as they could. And the prisoners of this were forced on a long and brutal, deadly death march to a prisoner of war camp at a place called Bataan. So the Bataan Death March was really bad for Americans. We also see that German U-boats are starting to sink American ships at sea, too. So here are American and Filipino soldiers on this Bataan Death March. Over 78,000 soldiers surrendered, and thousands died along the way due to disease, due to starvation, due to malnutrition, and due to straight-up murder by the Japanese troops. If you weren't walking fast enough, they were known to just behead people. America spent a lot of early 1942 sort of rearming ourselves and resupplying our forces, and very quickly we were able to turn the tide in the Pacific. One of the first places we did this was the Battle of the Coral Sea, where the American Navy was able to push back the Japanese Army, or the Japanese Navy, as they were steaming towards conquering Australia. We stopped them from doing that. In June of 42, thanks to our code breakers deciphering a Japanese code, we realized that they were headed for Midway Island, which was a small American island with an airstrip, and it was an American stopping point basically, and so we were able to defeat the Japanese at the very important Battle of Midway. This was a real turning point in the battle, or in the war. For us. So this battle destroyed a lot of Japan's biggest ships, and they no longer had the resources to rebuild, really, either. So after the victory at Midway, America began to move towards Japan with the idea of taking it over. As we're going to see, the atomic bomb gets a little interesting with this whole idea. But we were planning on taking over Japanese islands. And we would take an island, and then we would move closer to Japan and take that island and move closer to Japan. This is called island hopping, this idea. So here is World War II in the Pacific. You can see Pearl Harbor off to the right. The Battle of Midway is up and to the left of Pearl Harbor. Guam is further to the left near the Philippines. There's the Battle of Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea down there closer to Australia. And now, here also you can see these red lines showing how we hopped from island to island during World War II, getting ever and ever closer to Japan with the idea that eventually we were going to attack it and put boots on the ground in Japan. That ended up not happening. This is also called leapfrogging sometimes. Now, the main Allied powers of World War II, that is, the Allies being the US, England, and the USSR, and many other countries, but these are the bigs. We were slightly mismatched. We were not best buddies. America and England were pretty good friends by now, but we had very deep ideological differences with Joseph Stalin and the USSR. Remember the Red Scare? We had not liked these guys about 10 years ago. But we were willing to work with people who were willing to help us beat Germany. We said Germany and Japan, this is the main fear right now. We'll get back to not liking communism after you guys help us beat the Germans. Now, Stalin had really been getting rocked by Hitler for the past couple of months, and so he was calling for the Americans and the British to sort of help him out. But this was also leading towards a time where, like, he wanted to sort of dominate Eastern Europe after the war. Churchill wanted to sort of see Britain back to its former glory. FDR, as we're going to see, had plans to kind of be more like Wilson, to create a lasting international peace based upon diplomacy. So here are Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill at Tehran in 1943. So the trio had to decide, how are we going to attack the Germans? We got two fronts. We got the Eastern Front over in Russia. We got the Western Front over in France. Stalin said, hey, you guys need to help us out by attacking France. That's going to help ease a lot of the pressure on the USSR. However, Churchill and FDR were like, we're not quite ready for a full-on French invasion yet. We decided to attack the Germans in North Africa. They were not as strong in North Africa as they were in, say, France. And so after attacking North Africa, Allied troops went up to Sicily, the island of Sicily, and then went up to Italy, and this is how we got into Europe. In late 1942, early 43, the Allies defeated the Nazis in North Africa. July 1943, we invaded Sicily. Mussolini was eventually overthrown by his own people and was eventually shot in 1945. However, the Allies had to fight Germany in Italy way past 1944. So just because we got rid of Mussolini didn't mean we got rid of the Nazis in Italy. So here is the invasion of Italy in September of 43, going up through Sicily and up to the mainland of Italy. The largest involvement of American troops didn't come until June of 1944, and this is the Allied invasion of France, known as D-Day. On June 6, 1944, over 200,000 Allied troops, led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the overall commander of the Allied troops, landed on Normandy Beach in western France and were able to push their way into France and eventually to liberate Paris. By August, the Allies had reached Paris and they continued to push towards Germany. So by this point, we're heading towards Germany both from the Western Front, and as we're about to see, the Russians are pushing in from the east as well. So here is the Allied invasion on June 6, 1944, landing at Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. These are the Allied landing spots. Now, American and English soldiers had very little to do on the Eastern Front. We sent supplies to Stalin, but we did not send manpower to Stalin. So over on the Eastern Front, Hitler had invaded Russia in 1941, hoping that he could just blast his way through the USSR like he had done in Western Europe, and this was a blunder. This was a huge mistake by Hitler. The Russian winter froze his people, and Stalin was more than willing to just keep throwing bodies at the Nazis until they ran out of bullets, basically. It was a bloodbath in Russia, but in the end, Russian winter and Russian people were able to defeat the Nazis in Russia. He lost over 1 million soldiers, and many, many more civilians were lost during this time, especially in places like the siege of Stalingrad. But they were able to push the Germans out of the USSR thanks to a series of bloody kind of stalemate siege battles with very deadly victories on their hands. So here is Germany attacking Russia. Pro tip from Evil Beaver, never attack Russia in winter. Napoleon learned that, Hitler learned that. We don't attack, never get involved in that land war in Asia, basically, is what we're saying. And this is why. This is what a Russian winter will do to you, and the Russian soldiers, too. Not nice. So here also is what the war looked like in Europe during this time period. So we see the Allies pushing in from the Western Front, and eventually we are going to see the Russians coming in from the Eastern Front as well. We do see that, actually, if you look at the arrows pointing in from Moscow and Leningrad and Kursk and Stalingrad and several other places like that. The Russians are coming west, the Americans and the Brits are coming east, and we're going to meet in Germany. Now, speaking a bit more seriously, there were tens of millions of deaths in World War II. Soldiers died, civilians died. Death was common, frequent, and horrible. Of the estimated 13 million soldiers who died in the European front during World War II, most of them died in the USSR, thanks to the cold winters, the starvation, and again, Stalin's absolute willingness to let his people die. Millions more died from side effects of the war like starvation and disease. The most gruesome and well-remembered deaths of the Second World War, though, are the Holocaust. This is Hitler's attempt to exterminate anyone who he thought was not up to his master race ideal of Germans. He called this, he didn't talk about euphemisms. He did not call this the Holocaust. The word Holocaust really didn't come into use until after the war. He called this his final solution to the Jewish problem, is what he called it, which should give you the idea that this was mainly pointed towards European Jews. It led to the deaths of over 6 million people in concentration camps and death camps and in cities and in ghettos, mainly European Jews. The majority were European Jews. However, there were also groups that were considered by the Nazis undesirables, including gays, Catholics, Roma Sinti people, people with physical or mental disabilities, political prisoners, anybody who disagreed with the Nazis also went to these camps too. And here are some survivors of a concentration camp after it was liberated by the Allies.